You can live under the same roof with someone every day of your life and still not know who they really are. The story you're about to hear now sounds like something out of a detective series, the kind you binge watch and never sleep. But this is real. An ordinary young man raised in a home where everything seemed perfect, loving parents, a tidy house, an impeccable routine, began to notice small signs that something was wrong. Noises in the middle of the night, doors he was sure he had closed being found ajar, conversations suddenly interrupted when he approached. Simple things, but together, they created a feeling he could no longer ignore. Something in that house was out of place. But what he would discover when he installed a simple hidden camera would surpass anything he was prepared to see. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for. Maybe he just wanted a logical explanation. But what he captured changed everything. The camera, hidden behind some books in the corner of the room, showed what happened when he and his mother weren't around. And what was revealed there was the kind of scene that no son should have to watch. His father, the same one who for years was the model of integrity and kindness, acted completely differently when he thought no one was watching. In more than one recording, he seemed to be talking to someone on the phone, always at night, always in a low voice. So far, so good. But then, images began to emerge of him going through the family's personal belongings, rummaging through his son's belongings, deleting messages from his wife's cell phone, and even whispering names that made no sense at all. It was as if he were living a parallel life, one that no one inside knew. And the worst part, some of these recordings seemed to show his father coming and going from the house, without anyone noticing his absence. But that wasn't all. The son began to review all the recordings more carefully, and then in one of them, he noticed a very strange sequence. His father was standing in front of a wall in the hallway, motionless, just staring. For more than 5 minutes, he stood there as if hypnotized. He didn't say a word. He didn't move. He just stood there. When he finally turned around, he looked directly at the camera, which was supposedly hidden. There was no way he could have known about the camera, right? The son froze. That look, cold, direct, as if he knew exactly what he was doing, made him wonder, did my father always know he was being watched? Or worse, did he want to be seen? It was at that moment that everything became a psychological game. The son no longer knew if he was investigating or being investigated. For a long time, the house seemed perfect. The facade was clean, the garden was always well kept, and the routine was organized. Inside that home, everything worked as if it were a margarine commercial. The father was respected at work, the mother was active in the local community, and the son was a model student. The appearances were so convincing that no one, absolutely no one, suspected anything. But behind that apparent harmony, something very wrong was hidden. And the discovery of this secret began in an almost banal way, with a premonition. The son, a 17-year-old boy, began to notice small details that, at first glance, didn't seem very important. Objects that moved around, strange sounds coming from the hallway during the early hours of the morning, lights that were on that he was sure he had turned off. The feeling was that the house had a life of its own, as if it were trying to tell him something, but no one was paying attention. At first he thought it was all in his head. After all, who hasn't been confused by the hustle and bustle of everyday life? But the episodes became more frequent, clearer, and harder to ignore. One night, he heard heavy footsteps in the kitchen around 2 a.m. He got out of bed, peeked through the half-open bedroom door, and saw no one. When he went downstairs, everything was in its place. The floor was clean, the refrigerator was closed, and the lights were off. But on the table, there was a half-empty glass of water. He hadn't put it there. And the strangest thing, his parents were fast asleep in the next room, or at least they seemed to be. That night, he decided to take action. He bought a hidden camera online, the kind that looks like a regular charger. He set it up in the corner of the living room, where he had a reasonable view of the entrance, the stairs, and part of the hallway. The intention wasn't exactly to prove anything. It was just to clear up any doubts and calm his own mind. But when he reviewed the first images, he saw something that changed everything. In the video from the first night, around 2:30 a.m, his father appears in the frame. He is alone. He is wearing a white shirt, walking slowly with his eyes fixed on the floor. The camera shows him stopping in the middle of the room, turning to face the hallway and remaining completely still for more than 2 minutes. Then he walks to the corner of the wall and stands facing it. He doesn't say a word. He doesn't make a sound. He simply observes, as if he were listening to something that wasn't there, and then, without warning, he turns directly to the camera, the one that should have been hidden. For a moment, the father's gaze is fixed exactly on the lens as if he knew he was being watched, and then, without saying anything, he leaves the frame. The video ends there. The next morning, the son didn't say anything, but he was no longer worried. Why was his father acting like that? It didn't look like sleep, it didn't look like sleepwalking. It looked like something rehearsed, or worse, a ritual. Over the next few days, the images continued to reveal more than expected. In one of them, the father appears in the early hours of the morning, rummaging through his son's backpack. He carefully unzips it, takes out a notebook, reads a few pages, puts it back and arranges everything exactly as it was. In another, he goes through his wife's cell phone, checks messages, deletes photos, always at the same times between 2 and 3 in the morning, always in silence. He never turns on the lights, never makes noise. It was as if he had trained every movement so as not to be noticed. The son did not understand what was happening, but something inside him told him that this was much more than simple curiosity. It seemed like meticulous, controlled, planned behavior. That's when he decided to install a second camera, this time in his father's office. The room was rarely used during the day, but it was locked every night. When the camera was discreetly positioned among the books on the shelf, new images emerged, and nothing could prepare him for what he would see inside. The office, which had always seemed ordinary, hid a sinister routine. The recordings showed the father opening a drawer with a code lock, taking out old papers and envelopes, and spending hours leafing through pages with the names of various people written by hand. Some were crossed out, others highlighted in red. There were dates, times, and seemingly unrelated words such as confirmation, keep your distance, last phase. It was impossible to understand what they meant, but the obsession was evident. The father returned to the same notes night after night, scribbled carefully, consulted a small voice recorder, and listened to repeated excerpts of recorded conversations. At one point, he repeated the same phrase over and over. Only 2 to go. Only 2 to go. The son no longer knew if he was dealing with a case of split personality, a psychiatric disorder, or something more dangerous. He began to research similar behaviors, rituals, disorders, but no explanation seemed to fit. Each new recording only deepened the mystery, and the most disturbing was yet to come. One night, while randomly reviewing the footage, the son found a section where his mother appears in the office. She is alone. She opens the same locked drawer, looks at the same papers, and then, to his complete surprise, she calls someone. The camera doesn't capture the other person's voice, but her words are clear. He's already started acting. We're in time. The son freezes when he hears this. What exactly was starting? And who was we? This shattered all the certainties he had. His mother was involved too. The woman who for years had been the symbol of security in the house now seemed to be part of the same dark plot. For the first time, he considered that perhaps he was not dealing with an isolated case. Perhaps his entire family was hiding something. And he, until then, the only innocent one, was just another piece in a game that had been going on for a long time. The feeling of betrayal was devastating, but he knew that stopping there would be worse. He had to keep going, find out how far this would go, even if the truth was something he could never forget. In the days that followed, the son found himself in a constant state of tension. He could no longer sleep properly. He could not concentrate in class, and he barely ate. He spent much of his time locked in his room, watching and re-watching the recordings, trying to put together a puzzle of which he still did not know what the final image was. The house, which had previously seemed safe and familiar, now seemed like a minefield. Every look from his parents, every gesture, every common word carried a weight that had not existed before. He began to pay attention to everything. The way his parents exchanged glances during dinner, the way they avoided certain topics, the vague answers they gave to simple questions. Everything seemed planned. Everything seemed rehearsed. He no longer knew what was real and what was acting. Doubt gnawed at every thought, and the fear of being watched all the time began to become almost unbearable. It was in this state of paranoia that he decided to do something even riskier. He managed to access his father's laptop using a program he had secretly downloaded. He hoped to find documents, some message, something that would confirm what he already suspected. But what he found was even worse. There was a hidden folder with old videos, apparently recorded by a camera similar to the one he had installed. The videos showed other houses, other rooms, other families. In some recordings, children could be seen sleeping, women cooking, men watching television. Everyday scenes, but captured in a clandestine manner. None of the faces were familiar, and none of the places looked like their home. But all the files were organized with names, dates, and geographic locations. It was as if there were a catalog, a kind of database of lives that had been observed without consent. He was speechless. This was going beyond any limits. It was no longer just about his family. It was a network. Trying to understand what was behind it, he began to investigate the names and addresses listed in the files. He discovered that some of the people were missing. Others had been involved in unsolved police cases with details that suddenly seemed much less random. It was as if those recordings had been made to follow routines, map habits, understand vulnerabilities. And most disturbing, some of the dates coincided with periods when his father supposedly traveled for work. The son then began to review old calendars, hotel reservation confirmations, old conversations in the family group. Everything matched. The trips had occurred on exactly the same days that the videos were recorded. The conclusion was inevitable. His father was the author of the footage. But for what? What did he do with that information? And how did his mother fit into all of this? The questions grew at a pace that his mind could not keep up with. It was an abyss that opened up before him, and there was no turning back. The idea of going to the police began to gain momentum, but something was holding him back. Fear, perhaps. Fear that they wouldn't believe him. Fear of reporting him and making things worse. After all, he still lived in that house. I still shared meals with those people. At any moment, everything could turn against him. So he decided to seek answers on his own. He began to follow his parents discreetly. He installed a tracker on his father's car, put a microphone in his mother's bag. He did everything in silence without showing anything. If they were playing a game, he would play too. That's how he discovered that every Wednesday night, his parents met with a third individual in a disused warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place was abandoned, surrounded by tall weeds and apparently without any activity for years. But there, once a week, something happened. Lacking courage, he didn't approach the first time, but he filmed everything from afar with maximum zoom. The following week, he decided to get closer. He hid behind one of the metal containers and waited. Around 9 o'clock, his parents arrived. Soon after, an older man appeared. He was wearing a suit, his face partially covered by a cap. They went into the warehouse, turned on a single light, and began talking. He couldn't hear everything, but he caught a few words. Confirmation. Final step. We're in. The meeting lasted about 20 minutes. When they left, his son hid until he was sure they were out of the way. Then he went inside. The place was empty except for a table in the center and a shelf with folders and papers organized by year. Some had familiar names, others didn't. But what caught his attention most was a metal box locked with a padlock. He couldn't open it at the time, but he took pictures of everything. He drove home with his heart racing, wondering what was inside that box. Maybe definitive evidence, maybe memories of victims, maybe something even more disturbing. That night, he had trouble closing his eyes. He began to rethink his entire childhood. Every moment he thought his parents were just being protective. Every trip that seemed harmless. Every time he was left with relatives for no apparent reason. Everything could have a second meaning. And the more he thought, the more he noticed that there were gaps in his own story. Stories he had heard and never questioned. Absences that were vaguely justified. Conversations that were interrupted when he entered the room. It was as if his entire past had been built on a fabricated narrative to keep him inside a bubble. But now that bubble had burst, and he was no longer a passive player in that scenario. He needed to understand what the next step was. He needed to know how far this was going. And most importantly, he needed to decide whether to continue investigating or to put an end to it all before it was too late. The truth, however, could no longer be undone. What he had seen, heard, and recorded formed a terrifying puzzle. And there was something he had yet to tell anyone. In the lower corner of one of the warehouse footages, there was a reflection. Quick, barely noticeable. But he paused, turned up the brightness of the screen and froze the image. It was his face. His own son's face reflected in a window. This meeting was not as secret as he had imagined. They knew they were being watched. Or worse, they had set it up for him to find out. Like a test. as if he were the ultimate target of this whole act. The image of his own reflection captured on the video remained stuck in his mind like a mark he couldn't erase. What did that really mean? Was it pure coincidence or part of something bigger, meticulously planned? The possibility that he had been manipulated from the beginning began to become more real, more concrete. What if all that silent investigation, all the cameras, all the tracking, hadn't really been a secret from his parents? What if, from the very first moment, they had intentionally left clues, as if they were guiding him towards a specific path? The feeling of control crumbling was unbearable. For the first time, he felt like a piece within a script that someone else was writing. And now, he needed to understand what the planned ending to this story was. With his mind filled with doubts, he began to retreat. He stopped installing cameras, avoided new searches, and pretended that everything was as it had been before. But even in silence, he continued to observe. The routine at home seemed exactly the same. Meals were served at the same times, conversations continued with the same tone. But now, everything seemed like theater. Every word, every look, every gesture seemed calculated. It was as if he were living inside a play where everyone knew the script except him. And then came the turning point. One afternoon when he came home from school, he found a letter on his bed. No envelope, no recipient, just a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was his mother's. The words, however, seemed to have been written by someone else. There were no explanations, just one sentence. "It's almost time. When you understand, you'll know what to do." He reread the note countless times. Was it a threat? A warning? An invitation? Not knowing what to think, he decided to confront his mother. But when he walked into the kitchen, she was there, smiling as always, cutting vegetables for dinner. She seemed completely oblivious to the contents of the note, and when he asked her directly, she just laughed. "Letter? What letter? You're getting paranoid, my son." And she continued cutting as if nothing had happened. But her eyes, for a brief moment, lost their shine. And in that second, he was sure that she knew exactly what he was talking about. That night, the tension was almost palpable. They sat at the table like any other day, but no one really ate. His father talked about trivial matters. His mother smiled mechanically, and he pretended to be there, while his mind raced in 1,000 different directions. Were they waiting for him to act, testing how much he already knew, or just savoring the silence before the final revelation? He couldn't wait any longer. He had to get out of that house. He spent the next few days pretending to be normal, while secretly planning everything. He took some money on the sly, created a new email address, saved his most important files on an encrypted flash drive, and then, one silent night, while his parents were sleeping, he left. He grabbed his backpack, carefully locked the door, and disappeared into the darkness. He didn't go to friends' houses or hotels. He wanted to stay under the radar. He slept in train stations, 24-hour libraries, and small shelters. He used public Wi-Fi to continue researching, and the more he investigated, the more frightening the connections became. He discovered that the man who met with his parents in the warehouse appeared in old news stories, always linked to shady organizations, involved in events that never had a clear explanation. Cases of disappearances, suspicious bank transfers, closed investigations, always at the center, the same face, always without answers. During one of these searches, he found a direct reference to his own family's surname. An old article mentioned a charitable foundation involved in secret social experiments, using small communities to study human behavior under extreme conditions. The article had been taken down, but an archived copy revealed disturbing details. Volunteer families who received financial support in exchange for participating in long-term studies. The most bizarre thing was the date of the document. He had been born the exact same year the foundation closed its operations. And the city where it all happened was the same one his family had moved to shortly after he was born. This could not be a coincidence. Little by little, an absurd hypothesis began to form. What if he was the real subject of study? What if everything, his parents, his home, his life, had been shaped from the beginning to observe his reactions, to test his limits? The idea seemed insane, but it was the only one that made sense. His mother's words, "When you understand, you'll know what to do," now sounded like the conclusion of an experiment. He wasn't sure what they were trying to prove, but now he realized that every step had been set in motion. The camera, the shed, the video folder, everything seemed to have been put there for him to find. Maybe that was the real test. Finding the truth and deciding what to do with it. That's when he decided to go back. But not like before. This time, he would come back with evidence. He would report it. He would break the cycle. He sent copies of the files to an investigative journalist who worked on anonymous tips. He included videos, photos, audio, and a list of names and dates. After that, everything became a race against time. He didn't know how long it would take before his parents realized what he had done. When he returned home, he found everything as before. The door was unlocked, the kitchen light was on, the television was on low, but the silence seemed thicker. He climbed the stairs carefully, feeling each step creak beneath his feet. The bedroom was intact. The cameras had been removed. His father's computer was empty. The desk drawer was clean. Everything he had seen, everything he had discovered, was now erased. But he no longer needed the physical evidence. He had already handed it all over. And it was that night that his parents called him to talk. They sat at the table as they had so many other times. But this time, the mood was different. No masks, no disguises. The father, with a calm look, got straight to the point. "You finally understand, don't you? It's about time." The mother simply nodded, emotionless. The son didn't respond. He just watched. At that moment, he was no longer the curious boy trying to understand a mystery. He was the last link in a chain that had begun even before he was born. And now, with everything out in the open, there was only one last decision left. That dinner table, once the scene of trivial conversations about work, school, and weekend plans, now served as the setting for a revelation that the son would never have imagined facing. The house was silent, but the mood was one of total alert. There were no shouts, no threats, and no direct confrontation. The father simply stared at him with a steady gaze, filled with something difficult to define. It wasn't anger nor guilt, much less pride. It was as if he was waiting for his son to finally cross an invisible line, a border between ignorance and conscience. The mother, next to him, maintained a serene expression, but there was a rigidity in her body that betrayed her forced calm. Everything indicated that this was the moment they both knew would come, even if they had never spoken about it out loud. The son, still stunned, couldn't respond. He didn't know whether he should confront them, run away, or pretend that nothing had changed. But deep down, he knew that the decision had already been made. By exposing everything, by sending the evidence, he had pulled a trigger that could no longer be deactivated. The father was the first to break the silence. He said that everything had a purpose, that every step, every decision, every secret was part of something bigger. He didn't apologize, didn't try to justify it. He just said that this was the only way to ensure that his son was prepared. Prepared for what? He didn't say. The mother continued with vague phrases, mentioning choices made before he was even born, agreements that involved people he had never met, organizations that operated outside of everything that most people considered real. She spoke with a frightening serenity, as if someone were explaining a cake recipe, as if her son's destiny were just another step in a technical and inevitable process. The son, still unable to fully absorb those words, tried to control his breathing. Nothing made sense. And at the same time, everything seemed to fit together. The methodical behavior, the codes on the papers, the nocturnal meetings, the hidden files, everything pointed to a reality that he hadn't asked to be a part of, but that now completely enveloped him. Without telling him where they were going, his parents took him to the car. It was dawn, the street was deserted, and the city was asleep. During the journey, no one said a word. The son watched the city lights passing by like shadows through the window, trying to guess what the next step would be. When they reached their destination, he recognized it immediately. The same warehouse where it all began. The same place where he had secretly watched the mysterious meetings, where he had found files and traces of something much bigger than his understanding allowed at the time. Only now he was no longer the hidden observer. He was the guest, or perhaps the chosen one. The inside of the warehouse was different. There was lighting, organized tables, chairs in a circle. Other people were there, faces he had never seen, but who seemed to know exactly who he was. They greeted him with subtle nods, as if they had been waiting for him for a long time. In the center of the room, a screen displayed images from archives, old recordings, records of different locations and names. It was a complete collection of everything he thought he had discovered on his own. But now he knew. That investigation had never been just his. It was part of a test. A middle-aged man who seemed to be leading the group began to speak. He explained that the project his parents had been involved in for years had the goal of studying behavioral patterns in the face of altered realities. People were placed in artificial environments with carefully formed families, and their reactions to discovering the truth were monitored. His son was one of those studies. From birth, his life had been shaped with a single intention: to observe how far his perception, his distrust, his capacity for logical reasoning and action would go. That was why the clues were always within reach, but never too obvious. That was why his parents alternated between control and permissiveness. Everything had been meticulously planned. And now, after years of observation, the experiment was reaching its final phase. The result, according to the man, exceeded all expectations. He had not only identified the patterns, but also taken practical action, investigated on his own, exposed the system. It was considered a success, but there was one last decision to be made. Now that he knew everything, he had two options: join the project and participate in future studies as a researcher, or leave and forget everything he had experienced. Although, of course, forget was a symbolic word, since nothing would be erased from memory, just left behind. The son listened to everything in silence. No part of the explanation seemed less absurd than the previous one, and yet, there was a perverse logic in every detail. The people present did not seem disturbed. On the contrary, they were calm, focused, almost convinced that they were doing something noble, revolutionary. They talked about ethics, scientific progress, and the improvement of human understanding. But he only saw a great theater in which lives were manipulated, memories were created, and relationships were forged. How could he trust any feeling after knowing that everything was programmed? How could he look at his own parents and see anything other than agents infiltrated in a mission that used love as a conditioning tool? Even when faced with the proposal, he hesitated. Becoming a part of that would mean assuming that it was all worth it. Leaving there would mean living with the pain of lies, manipulation, and a falsified past. The decision had to be made there, at that moment. There would be no going back. Time seemed to stand still. The leader's words echoed like a kind of final ritual. The truth is never simple, but now it is yours. What you do with it will define who you are. He took a deep breath. He looked at the faces around him. Some were smiling lightly. Others were watching him expectantly. His parents remained in the background, motionless, waiting. His gaze met his mother's, and for a brief moment he saw something different. It wasn't coldness. It wasn't pride. It was sadness. A silent, resigned sadness. As if somewhere she had forgotten the woman she was before that role. His father didn't look away. He seemed satisfied, perhaps relieved. Then his son took a step forward. Everyone fell silent. The tension was almost solid in the air. He began to speak, and his words came out more firmly than he had expected. He didn't want to be part of a project that treated people like laboratory specimens. He didn't want to turn trauma into routine. He thanked them for their answers, but declined the invitation, and then he turned his back. The door to the warehouse seemed further away than ever, but each step toward the exit was also a step toward his own identity. Now he knew who he was, and more importantly, he knew who he didn't want to be. The night he left that warehouse was long, silent, and strange. There was no applause or pursuit, no one trying to stop him. The group just watched, as if they already knew what his choice would be. Maybe this was the last test. Maybe even his refusal had been foreseen, analyzed, anticipated in some hidden spreadsheet that measured human behavior as if it were just statistics. He walked through the deserted city as if he were returning from a war that no one else knew had happened. The streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk, and the sound of his own footsteps was the only thing he could hear. For the first time, he didn't have a plan. He no longer needed to figure out what was being hidden. Now he knew. The truth, however, didn't bring relief. It brought weight, a weight that settled deep in his chest, where before there had been only doubt. The following days were confusing. He avoided his parents' house, didn't respond to messages, didn't look for anyone. He needed time to breathe, think, reorganize his mind. He rented a simple room in a distant neighborhood, used fake documents that he had already prepared as a precaution, changed his cell phone number. He still felt watched, but now it was more paranoia than reality. He didn't know if the group was still tracking him or if, after his decision, He had been discarded, filed away as just another closed case. He tried to return to a normal routine, got a random job, started living among books, headphones, and cheap coffee. But normality was a fantasy that couldn't last long. At any moment, a memory could return. A sound or smell could bring back everything he wanted to forget, because forgetting was impossible. When you discover that your entire life was put together as part of a study, each memory takes on a new weight, a new layer. Nothing is simple anymore, not even silence. One day, on impulse, he returned to his old neighborhood. He walked through the familiar streets, observing the houses that seemed untouched by time. He saw children playing on the sidewalks, heard laughter coming from open windows. The streets seemed the same, as if nothing had happened, as if the world had not collapsed inside that house. The facade was the same, the plants still well cared for, the window of his old room half open. He did not have the courage to knock. He just observed for a few minutes, as if visiting a grave that has no name. And then he moved on. That house was now a place where he no longer lived, neither physically nor emotionally. He was no longer part of that structure, and perhaps he never had been. He returned to the rented room with a feeling that was hard to name, part mourning, part liberation. But what he did not yet know was that the experiment was not completely over. There was one last piece left, one last detail that had escaped his watchful eyes. Shortly thereafter, the journalist who had received the material contacted me. The evidence he had sent was being verified by an independent team, and some information had come to light. Among the files were records of other units of the same experiment, spread across different regions of the country. Families created from scratch, individuals trained to play specific roles, children born under contractual agreements. In many of these cases, the participants had disappeared or assumed other identities. Others had been kept under permanent observation, as if they were property of a project. What's more, his name appeared in documents classified as priority. There were references to future plans, steps that involved his insertion into other social classes for long-term monitoring. In other words, the experiment never anticipated his departure. He should have remained within the structure. When he left, he became a risk, a factor beyond control. The journalist warned that even without visible persecution, he should be careful. Some projects like this do not accept deviation so easily. With that, the fear returned. Now he knew that it wasn't enough to refuse. He needed to truly disappear, create a new life, far from everything. He traveled to another city, then to another state. He changed his appearance, routine, documents. He became almost invisible. He lived for months among people who knew nothing about him, people who never asked too many questions. He got a discreet job, began to live with the minimum, without social media, without traces. He tried to erase all traces of the past, but even hidden, he still carried within him the memory of what he had experienced. He couldn't trust anyone. Each new face brought doubt. Is this person real? Is this encounter spontaneous or staged? The doubt had settled in forever, and even in moments of apparent calm, he knew that the shadow of the project still followed him, invisible, patient, waiting for the next failure. A year later, he received an envelope with no return address, discreetly left in his mailbox. Inside, just a photo. He still a child in his mother's arms, smiling in front of a lake he didn't recognize. On the back, a handwritten sentence. "You were always more than we expected." Was it a reminder or a warning? A compliment or a threat? He didn't know, but it was clear that no matter how far he tried to go, they still knew where to find him. The message was subtle, almost poetic, but it carried a brutal weight. The project still saw him as part of it. No matter the distance, the time, or the escape attempts, his name was still registered, his story was still being followed. And perhaps, like so many other pieces of the experiment, he had never truly been free. It was a life on probation, a former participant living on the margins of his own past, trying to rebuild an identity he never got to choose. He decided he would never respond, that he would not give any sign. The photo was burned, the traces erased, but the memory remained. Every day he woke up remembering what he saw, what he discovered, what he refused. He knew that somewhere someone was still watching him, but he also knew that as long as he did not give in, as long as he did not accept being just another cog, he still held on to something valuable, his own conscience. The world around him could be false, the bonds perhaps fabricated, the story manipulated.